Hello and welcome to our discussion of cost report documentation templates. This is one of our 3 videos covering the new templates effective 10/1/22 and after. This particular video covers the DSH Medicaid Eligible Day listing. As we begin our discussion, we are going to provide a background of documentation requirements in general, and then we're going to discuss the actual DSH Medicaid Day template. So as a background, if we go back to August 17th of 2018, that's when CMS issued the Federal Register that first put into place a requirement that providers must submit listings of Medicare bad debts, DSH Medicaid eligible days, GME FTEs, and S10 charity care that correspond to the amounts reported on the cost report for those various items. At that time, basically, CMS was saying you need to have a listing for these items that you're reporting on your cost report, and it must be submitted with the cost report itself, rather than being requested at the time of audit. Now, I will say that was effective 10/1/18, fiscal year begins and after. And as you can see here, this is effective, again, for cost report periods beginning on or after 10/1/18. And the cost report will be rejected for lack of supporting documentation if it does not include a detailed listing. At that point, there was no specificity as far as what that template needed to look like. It just had to be a detailed listing that corresponded to the cost report amount. On August 21st, 2020, CMS issued Change Request 11644, which formally revised the cost report acceptability checklist that MACs must use when accepting that cost report. So this one was effective for cost reports received on or after 12/31/2020. Again, the rule was effective 10/1/18, fiscal year begins on or after, but it took a while before it was formalized into the acceptability checklist. But again, there was still no specific required template for what that documentation would look like. Now, at that point, I will say that we at WPS had posted a website article with that Federal Register with instructions as well as templates that we had created internally. These are not CMS mandated templates, but these were templates that we recommended providers use to give all the information that was necessary. Now, those templates, you may or may not have used those at that time. We are now talking about the new templates, the new version of these templates that are effective on or after 10/1/22. Now, if we go back to where we posted this on our website, if you go to the cost report audit section of the WPS GHA website, if you go down to the cost reports key issue, the category, and if you go down to cost report documentation requirements and templates, that's where you'll find the verbiage on both the old and the new templates. That's where you'll be able to download those templates from. So at that point in time, there was no specific requirement for exactly what fields needed to be included. On November 10th, 2020, CMS issued a proposed rule to obtain comments on proposed fields, proposed templates. Still not an actual Excel spreadsheet you had to fill out. You could have built your own, but it identified what headings you needed, what columns you needed, what information you needed. June 22nd of 2022, CMS issued a second proposed rule to obtain comments on, again, some further revised templates after considering the first round of comments. Then on December 29th of 2022, CMS implemented those changes through Transmittal 18 of the 255210 Hospital Cost Report form set. These instructions in Transmittal 18 include the new templates and the instructions. Now, again, I want to stress these instructions identify what fields need to be included and what the definitions of each of those fields are. There still is not a mandated Excel spreadsheet that you absolutely have to use. You could create your own following those instructions if you wanted. We have built a version of those templates with some instructions with a little bit of automation, and we've posted them to our website. We strongly recommend you use those, but you're not required to. If you submit your own version of the template and if it has all the proper fields, that is enough to get it accepted. Now, as a continuation of the overview, the videos we've been posting, the 3 videos we have, cover the DSH Medicaid Eligible Days. That's the one we're talking about right now, Exhibit 3A. Now, the instructions for this, if you go to the cost report instructions, the HFS software, and if you open up Worksheet S-2 Part 1, which is your listing of all the various control questions, at the very end of that worksheet, the instructions, you'll find the description of Exhibit 3A. We'll see that in just a bit. For Medicare bad debts, these are Exhibit 2A. You'll find those at the end of Worksheet S-2 Part 2, which is the hospital reimbursement questionnaire. For the S10 charity care charges, those are Exhibit 3B. You'll find those at the end of Worksheet S-10 Part 2. And the total bad debts for S10, you'll find those at the Exhibit 3C at the end of, again, Worksheet S-10 Part 2. We are focused on Exhibit 3A for this video, the DSH Medicaid Eligible Days. So if we go to Worksheet S-2 Part 1, not Part 2, but actually Part 1, that is the listing of all the various control questions that drive a lot of the cost report. If you scroll down to the very end, right here you'll see Exhibit 3A. It's after line 171. Exhibit 3A, the listing of Medicaid eligible days for a DSH eligible hospital, and you'll see all the definitions of the various columns. And then after that, you'll see Exhibit 3A itself. Again, this is the description of it, the illustration of it. You could put it into your own template. You could use our template, whatever works for you. Notice there are some required heading type columns, informational type columns, and then there's the actual spreadsheet itself. So this is where you'll find all the detailed instructions for this, but we're going to go through some of those in the template itself as well. So when you first download the DSH Eligible Day template from the website, you'll see 3 tabs that are opened. You'll see an Instructions tab, a Medicaid Days Summary tab, and you'll see one of the potential tabs you may need, the Acute In-State Paid for line 24, column 1. This is just so you have an idea what the template looks like. However, you may need more versions of this tab, and the development of those versions has been automated. More copies, if you will, for different items on the cost report. I'll explain that here in just a second. But if we go to the instructions, it talks about how this is required for cost report periods beginning on or after 10/1/22. It tells you where you can find the instructions, and then it gives you some of the information, some of the background of DSH in general. So as an example here, in the instructions and the definitions of this tab, we see a breakdown between in-state Medicaid paid days, in-state Medicaid eligible unpaid days, out-of-state. You see the various categories. Now notice there are references here to where on the cost report you'll find those. S-2 Part 1, line 24, line 25, column 1 or column 2. I want to show you what that looks like. So here, line 24 is all about an IPPS hospital. And again, they have the various columns for those days. Line 25 is for the rehab. And again, a column for each of those different types of days. Now, these different columns, and for that matter, these different lines, would all potentially need their own template. This section of the instruction tab just gives you the detail of what to include in each of those templates and each of those lines. Now, if we scroll down here, we are looking at the various columns that were listed in those instructions for the template. So all the various columns, we'll get to these in detail, patient, last name, first name, all of that. Some of these columns some of these fields, if you will, have a description, have additional notes to them. Now, sometimes this is above and beyond what you'll find in the actual cost report instructions. Sometimes it's just the same information. We're just trying to make it easier to see that. So this is the instruction tab. It gives you a lot of good information. If you go to the Medicaid Days Summary tab. Now, by the way, this tab, if you were building your own version of this template, you would not be required to have a tab like this. We built this to help you automate, to help you make the copies of the various tabs you'll need, as well as to give you a nice summary of what to put on your cost report for all those various lines and columns. Now, the way this works is, we have the hospital, the acute care hospital, and we have the rehab hospital or subunit. So depending on which one you have, you'd want to put that provider number in. You might have a hospital plus a rehab subunit, or you might just have one or the other. So you put the provider number in this orange field, and then as this instruction tells you, type X in the box, these yellow boxes related to the type of listing you want to generate. Now, I said earlier that one tab will always be generated just by default, just to give you an idea of what the template looks like. But let's say I put an X in this next cell. Keep an eye on what happens down here. If I put an X here and an X here, now all of a sudden I have two tabs. If I put an X down here in the rehab, and I just keep going down, it's basically creating a copy of that template for that specific item, and then the amount that gets summarized in this template would flow back to your summary right over here. So that's the automation that we think will help you out a little bit. So we have that, and what we're going to spend our time on now is the actual template itself. So it's a pretty straightforward template, but there are a few things that we really need to stress. Now, the first thing to note is that up here at the top, we have kind of header information, if you will. A lot of this comes from your Medicaid Days Summary tab, provider name, acute provider number, rehab provider number, which, of course, the rehab provider number only makes sense if it's a rehab tab to begin with. Now, if it's a rehab tab, and the number actually carries over, so this will only make sense, this rehab will only make sense if you have an acute care hospital with a rehab sub. That's what I'm trying to stress there. And it'll give you the identification of what type of day it is, where you're reporting it, the cost report fiscal year begin or fiscal year end, who prepared it and when it was prepared, and then more importantly, the total of columns 10 and 12, which we'll get to in a bit, but 10 is your Medicaid eligible days, and 12 is the newborn baby days, which are added to it. Because column 12 is a situation where you have a mother that just gave birth, so now there are technically two patients, the mother and the baby, the newborn baby. They are two distinct patients at that time. So in that situation, you'd have the mother having a day and the newborn baby having a day, and that would count for 2 days. Once the mother is discharged, then there's no reason to separately report the newborn baby days, because that newborn baby is now the only patient left. So they would be reported as a regular Medicaid eligible day. So that's the distinction there. Column 11 is your labor and delivery day, which is a different situation. It's been handled differently over the years, but it needs to be reported separately. Specifically, as you can see on worksheet S-3, part 1 of the cost report, down here, line 32, you have labor and delivery days that need to be reported separately. That's why that listing is important to get that information. So now let's go back to the main template itself and go through each of the fields. The first 5 fields are pretty much self-explanatory. They're patient claim information fields, patient last name, first name, the admit date, the discharge date, and the internal patient account number, so we can identify the records for this patient. If we request information, we know what to request. This is not a HIC number. This is not a Social Security number. This is the hospital-specific record number, if you will. Columns 6 through 8 are all about the Medicaid status, because keep in mind, this is DSH Medicaid Eligible Days, so this is really the heart of what we're looking for here. We need the patient's Medicaid recipient number, so we can identify that, yes, they are indeed a Medicaid recipient. The one thing I do want to stress here is that this template can also be used for Section 1115 waiver days, in which case there may not even be a Medicaid recipient number, and if that's the case, that's fine to include that. In situations like this, you might want to use the comments field to avoid being asked, hey, where's your Medicaid recipient number? State eligibility code. Let's go ahead and take a look at the instructions for this. State eligibility code, again, this is specific to your state. Every state's going to have a different type of code structure, but it identifies specifically what type of Medicaid coverage the patient had. And we need to know that, and more importantly, we need to know that it was truly Title 19. It was not just a state-only plan, it was Title 19. The eligibility code is what we are required to look at to make that determination. Now that's going to come from your state, possibly their website or whatever documentation they've given you, but we would need to see you report this eligibility code. Then we would be gathering information on our side to determine whether that code was truly eligible or not at that point in time. Number 8, patient population code. Now this is an unusual one, but let's go back to the instructions again. CMS, and this is word for word from the cost reporting instructions. CMS identified a coding structure they want you to use. So they want you to enter a unique patient population code to identify a restricted or unrestricted Medicaid eligible day. If it's restricted eligibility, they want an R-type code. So R1 should be pregnancy or labor and delivery services. R2 should be emergency services. And R3 through R9 you can use, and you can define what those are for other Medicaid eligibility. You just have to provide the definition for that code in column 18, the comments column. If it's unrestricted Medicaid eligibility, U1 would be a general code. U2 through U9 would be other user-defined codes that you would define in column 18 if you needed to use them at all. So that's the patient population code. 9 through 12, this is really the heart of what we're looking at here. Now, notice that column 9 is a little bit odd. It asks for the S-2 Part 1 column number, but we already know what that is since we're using a template that specifies what column we're dealing with. This would be needed if you were not using our template and if you were just building one big spreadsheet to cover all of the different columns, then you would definitely need this. So you can either put in column 1 and just autofill it all the way down. That'd be one way to do it. We've already identified what column it is up here. And then 10, 11, and 12, again, are the days for that particular claim. How many days were truly Medicaid eligible? Did you have any newborn baby days on top of that? Did you have any Medicaid labor and delivery room days? 13 and 14, just identifying the primary and secondary payer plans, if any exist, other than Medicaid. Medicaid may be the primary, so you might have Medicare and or Medicaid in some of these columns. Although I will say the Medicare piece would be a little bit unusual, and the reason for that is that if you have a Medicaid patient that also qualifies for Medicare, they should not generally be on this listing at all unless there was a portion of that time where they were not eligible for Medicare, because if they're eligible for Medicare for that entire period and they're a truly dual eligible claim, that does not belong on the DSH Medicaid Eligible Days template. That's where columns 15 through 17 come into play. We want to know, for column 15, Medicare Title 18 eligibility indicator. If we go to the instructions here, we want to know, is this Part A or Part B or both? And again, if it's Part A, that's where the question comes into play, because normally that would be dual eligible, and that would be found in the Medicare SSI ratio, and it does not belong in the Medicaid ratio. Therefore, it would not belong on this listing. However, there would be a situation where maybe they were not eligible for Medicare for that entire stay. So if that's the case, then the days outside of Medicare eligibility would be fine. If they're Medicaid but not Medicare for some portion of that stay, usually the earlier portion of the stay, those days would be fine. But any day that they are Medicare eligible for would not be allowed on this listing. So that's where 16 and 17 come into play. If they are eligible for Medicare Part A, we need to know, when did that eligibility start and when did it end? And we would compare that to the dates of service to identify how much, if any, of this claim is allowable for the DSH Eligible Day listing. Again, we have the comments here. So that's where you would add in any comments about any of these columns or just anything about this claim in general that you believe is important. So you'll want to go through and complete a listing for each of the columns that are applicable. It's going to carry over to your Medicare or Medicaid Days Summary tab, and it'll tell you what to report on that cost report. And you would submit this package, this entire worksheet, workbook, as part of your documentation for the cost report submission. So hopefully this has helped to clarify this template. Again, the template itself is not required, but if you build one internally, you do have to use all of these same columns. So thank you for your time. Hopefully this has helped, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I will talk to you in our next video. Thank you and have a great day.